Back, though, to when that editor contacted me in the 1970s, it's rare to be asked by a publisher, a major publisher, this was Houghton Mifflin, to write a book. And so I sat down to do what she had asked me to do. She didn't tell me what to write about. I had to choose that myself. And not surprisingly, I think, I chose an autobiographical story. I had grown up with a younger brother, baby brother, born when I was 6, and a sister who was 3 years older than I. My sister was my closest friend growing up, and she was also my worst enemy, as sisters are. My partner in crime often. My teacher sometimes. It was my sister who taught me to read. But my sister had died young. She died when she was 28. And when she died, I was 25, and I had 4 children under the age of 5. And when I got the telegram telling me of my sister's death, I took my oldest child onto my lap, a little girl 4 years old, and told her about my sister, the story of my sister and me when we were growing up. My children had never known my sister. She had lived in Europe. And my little girl, who's now incidentally 51 years old, but she was then 4, she listened sweetly for a little while, and then she was bored by my grief, and she wrestled herself away. And I began to tell that story to myself. Again and again, I found that I was retelling the story of my sister. And so when I was invited to write that first book, that's the story I wrote. And I fictionalized it. Because I was invited to write for young people, I made the 2 sisters 13 and 15, told the story through the eyes of the younger daughter about the effect on the whole family of the loss, the death of the older sister from cancer. That book was called A Summer to Die, which is a title I've never liked. But I was new to writing books, and I sat there in my house in Maine and wrote the whole book, had trouble with it along the way, did not know that I could have met with the editor to talk about the things that were giving me problems. Instead, I wrestled with them by myself. And usually that's a good way to work things out. One of the things I wrestled with was this. If the girls were 13 and 15, they had a little brother. And in the book, I put the little brother in. I was 13 in the book, so the little brother was about 5. And I'd written about 5 chapters, and I realized the book didn't have the right tone. And the reason was because that little brother was making it humorous. Little brothers do that in books. And the book was not going to be a humorous book. So I had to go back and rewrite those chapters and remove the brother. So he is not in that first book, A Summer to Die. And when it was published, I sent him a copy. The publishers always send the author 10 free copies. And usually I sign them and give them to my kids and now to my grandchildren. And at that time, my parents were still alive, so I sent them a copy. And I sent my brother a copy. By then, he was grown. He was practicing medicine in Virginia. And he wrote me, this is long before email, and he said, I read your book. It's very well written. I hope it's successful. The medical details are all correct. By the way, what happened to the little brother? And when I explained to him why I had taken him out, I think he understood. But I later wrote the only other of my books that's autobiographical. It's called Autumn Street. And when I sent him this one, I wrote him a note saying, here you are, John. I put you on this one. You appear on page 100. And in this book, which is not a book for young children, but in this book, the protagonist, the little girl who is me, is only 6 years old. When I was 6, during the war, my father was gone. I had a friend who was murdered. So this book is about that, and that's why it's not for young children. But when I was 6, my brother was born, and so here he appears for the first time on page 100. I pictured my brother picking this up after I said you're on page 100 and turning to that page. In the book, I named him Gordon. It says, of Gordon's few baby skills, there was only one that I admired. Sometimes when Mama bathed him, I watched as he lay squirming and naked in her arms. And sometimes he peed into the air, high and arched like a rainbow. Oh, I wish I could do that. I confided in Mother. She smiled. Well, she said, you're a girl. Girls can't do that. I already knew that they couldn't. I had tried myself privately in the bathtub. and met with humiliating failure. "Can Daddy do that?" I asked. "Goodness," said Mother, "I suppose he could." "My friend Charles can." "Elizabeth," she said, "you haven't—" I caught my error quickly. "Oh no, I haven't seen him do it. I meant that I suppose all boys can." But I was lying. I had seen Charles do it often behind the lilacs where he aimed at ants. The child who was murdered in my childhood was a little girl, and her name was Gloria. I changed Gloria to a boy in the book, and I've always explained that by saying that the book is so populated with females, myself, my mother, my grandmother, my sister, that and my grandmother's cook, who's an important figure in the book, that I just changed Gloria to a boy to put a male character in. But the truth is, I think in writing it, because it was a real memory and a real grief, I distanced myself from it a bit by changing Gloria into this little boy, Charles. Okay, so those are the only two of my books that are autobiographical, but when I'm asked where I got the idea for something, of course, often it's my own history that I go back to that has triggered one thing or another. The book, The Giver, which I can't remember, I'd have to count up where it falls into my body of work. Don't you love that phrase? It's in the middle someplace. And it came along at a time when I had probably finished a book and hadn't yet started a new book, and was beginning to wonder, as I often do, whether my brain has turned to oatmeal and I'm never going to have another intelligent thought. I always worry that that was it, that was the last book I'm ever going to write. And then an idea appears. In this particular time, my parents were quite elderly, and they were in Virginia, and they were in a nursing home, both of them. They were in different sections of the nursing home, and I would fly down from Boston about every 6 weeks to see them. My brother was a doctor who lived nearby and saw them often. And this particular visit, I went first to see my mother, who was in the medical section of the nursing home, because she was clearly approaching the end of her life. She was blind, she was on oxygen, she was bedridden, but her mind was absolutely intact. And I would sit by her, and she would, on this visit, did once again talk about, she would listen politely to my little bits of news, but she wasn't interested really anymore in what I was doing, what my kids were doing. She wanted to talk about the past and give me pieces of her past. And sometimes they were stories I'd heard before, and sometimes they were new memories that she had brought forward and gave to me. But she, on this visit, talked about the day that my sister died. Now, clearly, that was the worst day of my mother's life. It would be, as you can all imagine, to lose your child prematurely. I, since that time, have lost one of my children, so I know what that day is like in one's personal history. But she wanted to talk about it, and I was there to receive that story from her. When she tired, I went to see my father, who was in the assisted living wing. He was older than my mom, but he was up and around. It was just that he was losing his memory and couldn't live alone any longer. And so my brother and I had prepared a photograph album for our dad, and it was filled with pictures from his past and ours. And sometimes turning the pages, and on this day turning the pages, certain pictures would trigger a memory for him. My brother and I were cruel in that we had put pictures of dogs in. Both my brother and I are dog lovers. My father hated dogs. And when we were children, every time he was off at a war, Mom would let us get a dog. And then the war would end, Dad would come home, and the dog would disappear somehow. We were always told that they'd found a good home for it on a farm. I never really believed that.